Well, greetings, everybody. Great to see everybody here today for another exciting lecture with your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. Our topic for today is one in the series that I've done on Jewish history. As we all know, every neighborhood of New York has its Jewish community, and each one is very different. We all know about the Lower East Side of Manhattan with the huge Orthodox influx from Russia and Eastern Europe in the late 1800s. We know about the German neighborhoods where the German Jews came over in the 1840s and 50s. And today we have Forest Hills in the middle of Queens, which is another fascinating neighborhood with Jews coming from Central Asia and Russia, coming in the 1990s. So we're going to explore one of the neighborhoods, and that is Brooklyn. So that's me standing on the Brooklyn Bridge. Where else to begin? If you want a wonderful experience, walk across the Brooklyn Bridge sometime, and you will have a wonderful experience. So once again, this is our outline for today, a little bit about the history of Brooklyn, the Dutch settlement of Brooklyn, German Jewish Brooklyn, 1830s, 40s, and 50s, Eastern European Jewish migration, the late 1800s, Hasidic Brooklyn, enclave of Eastern European Orthodox and Hasidic Jews, and then Jewish Brooklyn today. So let's get started. The name Brooklyn is of Dutch origin. It means Brooklyn, which means basically the little bridge. And on the picture on the left, we see the huge Dutch claim, all of the yellow in the middle, which includes Connecticut, Rhode Island, half of Massachusetts, upstate New York, the whole way to the St. Lawrence, as well as Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And that green thing at the bottom, that is Delaware. The pink areas were established by the English. These were our Puritans up in Boston, who also claimed a big chunk of Long Island. Now, don't forget, Brooklyn and Queens are on Long Island. So Brooklyn and Queens and a little bit further in were claimed and settled by the Dutch, and the other areas, Islip and out to the Hamptons, was settled by the English. Of course, the Dutch capital was New Amsterdam, and there we see it on the right with the Fort Amsterdam at the bottom of Broadway. We see the city wall going up and down in the picture on the right. This is today Wall Street. Well, Brooklyn began as a Dutch colony, and both Brooklyn and Queens were the place where the good Dutch Reformed Christians dumped people who wanted to settle in the colony, but they didn't want them polluting the rather Puritan lives of the Dutch in Manhattan. So they would send people who wanted to settle in the colony to the outlying areas. For example, on the right, we see the Quaker Meeting House, which was founded by English Quakers in 1645. Now, of course, Flushing is the modern form of Vlissingen, which is a town in Holland. Well, other groups, in addition to Baptists and Quakers who were settled in Flushing, also were settled in Queens and Brooklyn, as well as the Bronx, people from Denmark. Mr. Bronk, where we get the name Bronx, was settled by Danes. Irish Protestants came. German Amish and Mennonites settled in the city. English Anglicans, Church of England, English Methodists. There were Native Americans in Queens and Brooklyn. African slavery was a major institution in the colony. The only people who were banned from coming and settling in the Dutch colony were, of course, the Catholics. I mean, everybody was afraid of the Catholics. If you let them into Boston or even later in Virginia or the Dutch colony, those Catholics would end up linking up with the Spanish, who controlled the whole western half of the United States, as well as Florida, the French, who controlled the Mississippi Valley and New Orleans and Quebec and Montreal, and the Catholics would take over North America and expel all of the Protestants, as the French had done with the Huguenots. So Catholics were banned. Now, Bruggelein basically means marshland. Some people say it means a little bridge, but marshland tends to be the one that people accept. And the area called Brooklyn, which you see on the map on the right, was part of the larger part of New York, which is today Brooklyn. So it began as just a small settlement in 1646. And the Dutch established various towns in what is today Brooklyn. Gravesend was where they dumped the English Anabaptists. These were the people who only baptized adults. Brooklyn, 1646. Flatland, 1647. Midwood, which is today Flatbush, 1652. New Utrecht, 1657. Bushwick, 1661. And so you see on the map that a small settlement would be established, but since these were agricultural settlements, you'd have a town hall and you'd have maybe a school, but the majority of the people were farmers. They were chopping down the trees and turning the forested areas of Brooklyn into farmland. There is a town in Holland named Bruggelein, which we see on the picture on the right with, of course, your Dutch canals. And on the map on the left, you see on the right-hand side where it says Utrecht. Going north is Bruggelein on the road to Amsterdam. So like New Amsterdam was named after Amsterdam, New York was named after the city of York. Well, so Bruggelein wasn't called New Bruggelein for some reason, but it kept the name simply Bruggelein. Gradually, the Dutch and the various settlers started putting their footprint on the various areas of Brooklyn. Now, they dumped all kinds of heretics out there. But the Dutch also built churches. The Dutch Reformed Church, you see one on the left, the Dutch Reformed Church in Brooklyn, 1654. The New Utrecht Reformed Church, reformed the Protestant Church of Flatbush, always surrounded by their burial ground. The cemetery is separate. When it is a cemetery around a church, it is called the church's burial ground. And so the Dutch definitely put their imprint on the colony. Now, the first Jews who arrived in the Dutch colony of New Holland or New Amsterdam town arrived in September of 1654. These were 223 Sephardic Jews. These were Jews who had been expelled from Spain back in 1492 and had settled, some in Holland and London and France, with the majority going to North Africa, some settled in Palestine, in Turkey, and the Turkish Empire, and a handful ended up settling in Holland. Well, in the 1650s, Holland was the up-and-coming world power. And see the picture at the bottom where you see what is today the country of Brazil. The Dutch were eagerly building settlements in Brazil and were taking over the area, which is today Brazil, from the Portuguese. Well, by 1654, the Portuguese had gotten the upper hand and they expelled the Dutch, and they also expelled the Jews. And the Jews had no intention of remaining under Spanish or Portuguese rule because they had already expelled the Jews. And so the Jews knew that it was best to get out while the getting was good. So in September 1654, they boarded a ship and they were on their way back to Holland. Well, they decided to stop off in New Amsterdam, another Dutch colony, and they arrived in September, which is the Jewish New Year, Shana Tova, as they say in Hebrew. And they found this New Amsterdam had some economic potential. The Dutch were relatively tolerant. And so they decided to remain in New Amsterdam and not go back to Holland. In 1654, they established an organization which later became the Shearith Israel Synagogue. But of course, they were very few in number, and many of them ended up disappearing or simply marrying into Dutch families and assimilated. But by 1730, they had enough Jews in Manhattan to build their first synagogue. You see it on the left, a rather modest little affair. And today, Shearith Israel continues to exist. This is the current synagogue at the bottom. Now, of course, when they first arrived, like many small groups, they didn't have enough money to either have a synagogue or even rent a room. So many of them would use the donkey mill, which we see in the picture. And New Amsterdam had several mills. Some were windmills, some were horse or donkey mills, where they would grind corn and wheat into flour. And so Peter Stuyvesant, even though he didn't like Jews very much, disliked them as much as he disliked and feared the Catholics, but he was persuaded to let them stay. Well, gradually, the various groups started establishing themselves. Well, Brooklyn and Queens, as being sort of the dumping ground for unwanted people, gradually developed its own sense of individual and religious freedom. And in 1657, when Peter Stuyvesant decided that he should put a little bit of order into his colony, all these strange immigrants were getting rather unruly. And so he decided to expel the Quakers and the Baptists, who were the most militantly Protestant. Well, the community of Baptists and Quakers in Flushing, Queens, decided that they were not going to put up with this religious persecution. So they wrote a letter to Holland, which you see in its burnt edges in the middle picture, where they demanded religious freedom for all Christians, for Jews, and even Turks and Egyptians, which in their parlance meant Muslims. So it was a Flushing remonstrance. Remonstrance means to protest. They protested Peter Stuyvesant's expulsion order, and Holland responded saying, Peter Stuyvesant, we need settlers, we need people, we have to build up this colony, or we're going to lose it to the English or even to the French and Spanish. And so they were allowed to stay. And as you can see from the postal stamp on the left, the Flushing Remonstrance is considered the first declaration of religious freedom in the North American colonies. Well, the first Jew who we know of who settled in what is today Brooklyn was Asher Levi Van Swollen. The only thing we know about him is that he died in 1680s. He came to New Amsterdam in 1654, and it is believed he was one of the first Sephardic Jews on the ship fleeing the Portuguese colony of Brazil. He ended up becoming a rather successful real estate speculator, buying and selling land in Albany, Manhattan, Brooklyn. One point, he owned a butcher shop on Wall Street, and eventually ended up settling in the area called Gravesend, which is in Brooklyn today. So we do know about him, and as you can see from the medal above, he was known. It was known that he was a Jew, and a lot of other Jews probably were here even before him, but assimilated or just stopped really being Jewish, because if you only have 23 Jews, it's going to be very difficult to support much of an institution. Although the first Jewish institution in New York or New Amsterdam was actually the cemetery, because when the 23 arrived from Brazil, someone had died on the boat, and Jews do not practice burial at sea. And so, as soon as they got to New Amsterdam, they had to get a cemetery. Well, back then, cemeteries were controlled by churches and religious groups. So the first Jewish institution was not a synagogue, but it was a cemetery. Well, this first struggling tiny community of Jews managed to survive and preserve its identity. And when the English sailed into New York Harbor, New Amsterdam Harbor, and told old Pegleg Peter Stuyvesant, you have a choice. You can either fight, and then we will bomb the city back to smithereens, or you can surrender. And if you surrender, all the people who live here will be guaranteed that they'll be allowed to keep their homes, their businesses, their houses of worship. Everything would remain the same, but it would be just the English flag. Well, Peter wanted to fight, but his son, his wife, his family, and most of the people in New Amsterdam said, we don't really care what flag flies over the city. We just want to continue our lives peacefully. So Peter Stuyvesant was basically coerced into surrendering. Well, Brooklyn continued to attract English settlers, Methodists, Anglicans, and large numbers of Dutch remained there with their church. The next big event in the history of Brooklyn was during the American Revolution. The English landed off the coast of Brooklyn and started marching across Brooklyn in August 27, 1776. We do know that there were Jews serving in Washington's army, that they had already established a presence in Philadelphia and as far south as the Carolinas. Well, George Washington was basically a pretty lousy general. And so the Battle of Brooklyn Heights was a big defeat for him. He fled across the East River to Manhattan and was pursued by the British. Well, following the American Revolution, George Washington was smart enough to get some good generals from France and from Poland and Germany, Prussia, and managed to defeat the English, and gradually the colonies won the war and the English left. Well, Brooklyn remained pretty much the same. It had its little settlements, basically farmland, and was a rather, peaceful bedroom community. I mean, to go from Brooklyn to Manhattan was a major undertaking over land. It was a long, arduous journey, and then you had to get across the East River by boat. And so it was sort of a city developed on its own. The population of Brooklyn slowly grew by the American Revolution. There were about 3,000 to 4,000 people in all of Brooklyn. And we do know that by the American Revolution, the Jewish community had started to grow and had reached 242 Jews in all of what is today New York City. Following the American Revolution was the big period of Germanic migration, along with Irish fleeing the potato famine. Among the Germans who migrated, there were, of course, German Reformed Christians, like my grandmother's family. There were German Catholics, like my mother's family. Loads of German Lutherans. We have Lutherans in our family as well. And the German Jews were part of this German migration. And gradually, as we can see, from 1800 to 1840, some 40,000 people lived in the colonies. And gradually, the city, the 5 boroughs today, gradually was attracting more and more immigrants. And so beginning, following the American Revolution, was a period of German Jewish migration, most of them settling in Manhattan, but gradually some of them found their way across the East River to what became known as Brooklyn. If you look at the map on the left, you see at the top of the picture, New Town. That's where I live. And on the right, you see Flushing. That eventually became known as Queens, and the area at the bottom was split off, and that became known as Brooklyn. But you can see from the map, Brooklyn, right in the middle of the picture, you see Brooklyn, and you see a couple of houses there. So it was at that time just a small town. The first known Jewish resident of Brooklyn following the revolution was a man named Adolph Baker, who settled in Williamsburg, Virginia, a very nice area even until today in Brooklyn. Gradually, other Jews arrived, and as they were taking census, as the city grew in the 1800s, they would list not only the names, such as we see Benjamin Levy, Daniel Levy, another Levy, whose first name we don't know, but they were in business, an auctioneer, cartman, variety shop owner. So the Jews gradually entered into the commercial life of the city. A very famous person from this period, one of the German immigrants, was called the Iron Batter. And this was Lippmann Emanuel Pike, 1845, 1893. He was the first Jewish professional baseball player and was instrumental in the rise of what was called the Knickerbocker game back in the early 1800s, which today we call baseball. And Knickerbocker means an old-time New Yorker. And so here again is a person of Jewish descent who we know from documentation that he became rather famous. The Brooklyn Dodgers developed its own reputation in sports, established 1890, founded 1876, but then became known as the Dodgers by 1890, and they left New York and Brooklyn in 1957. They were called the Dodgers because the trolleys that were being built following the Civil War in Brooklyn and New York were notoriously dangerous. They didn't stop for anybody. And so you had to dash away whenever you saw a trolley coming. And so for some, I guess the Brooklyn trolleys were especially dangerous. In 1848, the German Jews established their first major synagogue. This is a Kahel Kadosh Beit Elohim. Beit Elohim means the house of God in Williamsburg. It was founded by German Jews. As you can see from the picture, very often a new religious group to the city would simply buy an apartment turn it into a synagogue or a church, and then later would rent a place. And very often, as migrants moved around, or one religious group had a rather nice church, and then they decided to build a bigger one, so they would sell off the old one. And so here we see the 1876 Keene Street Temple. Temple means they are now Reform Jews, not Orthodox Jews. Most German Jews were Reformed, liberal. This was another synagogue, 1869. As you can see, the Brooklyn community is growing, beginning in a private home, gradually renting a space in a YMCA, taking over a former church, 1872, and by 1891, they were wealthy enough and organized enough and populous enough to build their own synagogue. And here we see what was called the Union Temple of Brooklyn on Eastern Parkway. Eastern Parkway is very famous in Brooklyn Jewish history because that is where today the Lubavitcher Group is located. So gradually, synagogues were being built. Arnold Brunner was a famous German Jewish architect who built temples. He built Shevet Israel in the middle picture, the Sephardic synagogue. He built Temple Israel on the right, which is up in Harlem. He built the Union Temple of Brooklyn, a Reformed Jewish congregation established 1848, high point of German immigration. In the middle, at the bottom, you see a synagogue which he designed, but which was never built. Once again, look at the architecture. It's Greek and Roman. It is not Christian, Gothic, or anything like that. It is going back to the democracy of ancient Greece, the Republic of Plato. Rodef Shalom opened in 1878. Now, the problem with New York was by the Civil War time, as the city was growing, it was gradually creeping up Manhattan. And so by 1852, New York City forbid burials in Manhattan. Now, in 1852, New York City was Manhattan. Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx were independent, and it was only in Manhattan. So gradually, cemeteries were being built. Now, the oldest cemetery is one, Shevet Israel, dating from 1656. There you can see it was closed in 1833. The second one was built. But by 1852, they had to move their cemeteries to Brooklyn and Queens. Congregation Beit Israel, founded 1856. This claims to be the oldest continuously operating synagogue. As people would move, they would establish a synagogue and then they would move someplace else. But this was the continuously operating synagogue in the same building. And this was a mixture of Bavarian, Dutch, and Portuguese Jews. They built their synagogue 1862, just in the middle of the Civil War on Long Island. And gradually, the Jewish community of Brooklyn was growing. Now, the problem with a lot of these synagogues is people were very busy making a living, trying to keep alive. And there were very few rabbis in America. First one who we call him a rabbi today, was Gershom Seixas, who was a Sephardic from the Portuguese colony of Brazil, who became the first American rabbi. Even though he was not a rabbi, he was the cantor. He was a chazan, but he performed the functions of rabbis because there were no rabbis. He also established the synagogue in Philadelphia during the American Revolution. Of course, the German Jews brought their culture with them. Here we see the Hebrew. The Liebmann Brewery in Bushwick existed until 1978. Samuel Liebmann and his sons, Joseph, Henry, and Charles. Brooklyn had more breweries than any city in the United States, and beer was part of the German Jewish, Catholic, Lutheran, Reform culture. Brooklyn gradually grew. In 1848, remember, Brooklyn was an independent city. It was not part of New York. It was an independent city all its own. And here we see the new Borough Hall, or the City Hall of Brooklyn, in 1848. The slogan of Brooklyn was Eintracht macht. Unity makes might. Here again, reflecting the diversity of the population of Brooklyn, showing that it is a city that accepts and tolerates all. By 1898, it was decided to try to merge the 5 areas: Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, and Manhattan. Well, Brooklyn and Queens were not thrilled with merging with Manhattan because they knew they would be overwhelmed by the more populous Manhattan. But gradually they were won over, and Brooklyn, which in 1890 was the 3rd largest city in the United States after Manhattan, Chicago, and third came Brooklyn. New York City merged with Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, and Greater New York was born. Well, by the late 1800s, there was a big new migration into the city, and these were no longer the German Reform Jews. These were Eastern European Jews from the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Turkish empires, which dominated the Eastern European region. Beginning in 1870, large numbers of Eastern European Jews were fleeing religious persecution in Russia, pogroms, and a Russification process in Russia. Turn them into Russians, stop speaking Yiddish, start learning Russian. Same thing in Austria. And so more and more of the Orthodox Jews started coming to New York. Well, the great Castle Garden Immigration Center, which you see in the picture, it still exists in Lower Manhattan. And that was the processing area for immigrants until 1890, when so many immigrants were coming in that it was decided to build a new federally controlled immigration center, which we all know about. Gradually, with political unification and economic unification, transportation began to link Brooklyn and New York, or Manhattan. The Brooklyn Bridge, 1883. Elevated trains by 1885. The Williamsburg Bridge, 1903. And the underground subway system surged across the bridges and into the heart of Brooklyn. Picture in the middle shows the subway crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, and then in Brooklyn, in many sections, becoming an elevated train. So Brooklyn gradually started merging with Manhattan. Eastern European Jewish immigration skyrocketed. We see, look at the 1890s, 1900s, 8 million coming into the United States. This is the high point. Following World War I, the outbreak of World War I, the immigration began to decline. But many of these Jews settled in the famous Lower East Side of Manhattan, but many of them also found homes in Brooklyn and Queens. A wonderful book, At the Edge of a Dream, the story of Jewish immigrants on New York's Lower East Side. That is the most famous neighborhood. In fact, by 1900, there were 500,000 Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews. Well, as these Jews got assimilated, the younger people learned English, the men got jobs. They wanted to get out of the tenements and the slums of the Lower East Side, and many started moving. Many went up to Harlem, which was developing in the late 1800s, but many came across the bridges and started settling in Brooklyn. So the German immigration gave way to Eastern European migration. Now, if you look at the Eastern European immigration, we see that immigration was skyrocketing as people went through the Ellis Island Immigration Center. And once again, this growth of huge numbers of Jews coming into the United States continued and continues until today. World War I put an end to the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Well, immigration after World War I was problematic because after World War I, the United States basically decided we have enough immigrants flooding into the country. And so the United States slammed the doors by the 1920s to immigrants. Well, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews fleeing Russia, which after World War I had become communist. Countries like Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland had gotten their independence from Russia, Germany, and Austria. And these hundreds of thousands of people had no intent of remaining in communist Russia or nationalistic Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or Poland. Well, the Eastern European Jews, when they were still coming in the late 1800s, of course, had to find jobs. And Brooklyn had a lot of jobs to offer. We see the Brooklyn Navy Yards, shipbuilding industry. During the Civil War, almost every ship used by either the North or the South was built in the Brooklyn Navy Yards. Coney Island, with its magnificent hotels and later mass entertainment, offered employment and financial opportunities for everybody. And the Jews definitely got into the entertainment, hotel industry, and other types of industry. In fact, Coney Island was so famous because of Mr. Feltman, the inventor of the hot dog. His tomb in Brooklyn is in the picture there. And his famous Feltman restaurant, which he opened, was really considered the hot dog capital. It was a takeaway food. You didn't have to sit down at a restaurant, but you just got food. You walked around, maybe some French fries and a hot dog. Beginning of the fast food wonder of American cuisine. Nathan's Hot Dog, another Jewish presence in Coney Island, founded by Nathan Handwerker in 1916. The famous hot dog eating contest continues until today. I'm always impressed. It's always some scrawny little skinny guy who ends up eating all the hot dogs, not some big fat guy with you'd think it'd have a lot of stomach room, but it's always some scrawny guy. Sometimes it's somebody even from Asia who I have no idea what their trick is, but they can pack away the hot dogs. The Eastern European Jews built their own separate Jewish establishments. They wouldn't go near an old German Reform synagogue. The Orthodox Jews wanted to preserve their Eastern European culture, language, Yiddish, and religious traditions. And so they built the infrastructure of an ethnic neighborhood. Brooklyn Ladies Hebrew Benevolent Society, Brooklyn Hebrew Hospital Society, that one was reformed. Brooklyn Hebrew Orphan Asylum by the Reformed Jews, and the various Orthodox groups also built their own hospitals, their own orphanages, their own yeshivas and schools. A little-known group that migrated to Brooklyn were the Syrian Jews, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, that following the decline and collapse of the Turkish Empire in World War I, many of the Jews decided to leave Syria and migrate to Brooklyn. In fact, by the turn of the century, it's estimated there were some 70,000 Syrian Jews with 20 synagogues, which still exist today, as, once again, the Syrian Jews have their own language, their own culture, their own traditions, their own cuisine, their own way of dressing, and added to this Jewish diversity, which is so typically Brooklyn. The German Jews and the Eastern European Jews did not really get along very well. The German Jews spoke fluent German, not a word of Yiddish. They went to the opera. They loved Wagner. They loved Goethe and could quote entire passages of German poetry. In fact, one of them, in describing the Jews of the Lower East Side and the Eastern European Jews, described them as miserably darkened Hebrews with whom the thoroughly acclimatized American German Jews have no religious, social, or intellectual ties. Many of them even denied that they were actually Jews. Well, more institutions were built. Here we see the Educational Alliance. This was established by the German Jews in the Lower East Side to civilize the Eastern European Jews, teach them trades, teach them how to speak proper English. They would hold dances on Friday night where a man and a woman would dance the waltz when Orthodox Jews were supposed to be in a synagogue. They taught girls how to type so they could become secretaries and get a job and not sit at home waiting to be married off by their mother and father. Other Jewish organizations established in Brooklyn to civilize, as many German Jews would say, were the YMHA, Hebrew Association in Borough Park, sponsored by wealthy German Jews. This was the Hebrew Educational Society in Brownsville, founded 1899. This building was built in 1913 as an educational center for the adjustment of the Jewish immigrant to the New World. Once again, stop speaking Yiddish, stop wearing funny clothes, get a job, go to the opera, become a civilized modern American. So the hostility between the German Reform Jews and the Eastern European Orthodox Jews was very pronounced. Many of the Jews became very successful. But of course, the German Jews and most Christians looked down on these Eastern European Jews. The famous Coney Island Hotel even described the Eastern European Jews as Jewish, uncouth manners and distasteful. And there was a discrimination against Orthodox Jews, and especially Yiddish and Eastern European Jews. The German Jews established in Manhattan the Harmonie Club, harmony spelt in the German way. And this was a club for good quality German-speaking Jews. No East Jews need apply. Following World War II, there was another massive migration of Jews to Brooklyn. Manhattan had already become too expensive and filled with people. The various Hasidic sects, the survivors of the Holocaust, ended up migrating to New York as well as other cities and trying to reestablish their rabbinical dynasties, their culture, their language. One of the more famous survivors of the Holocaust was Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, famous name in Hasidic Satmar groups. They are, until today, viciously opposed to the state of Israel and what they consider the genocide of the Palestinians, saying that the Orthodox Jews should not take up a gun and go off and kill Palestinians and make a Jewish state, but they should wait for the coming of the Messiah, who would achieve some miracle, and the Jews would be miraculously returned to what they consider their homeland. That people should not force the hand of God. So they remain very prominent in Brooklyn. Many of them are now established settlements up the Hudson River because their numbers are rapidly growing. Another Holocaust survivor group were the Lubavitchers, founded by rabbis, and the current leader when they came to the United States was Menachem Schneerson. And they settled in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. And they have their own unique culture. They believe that Menachem Schneerson was the Messiah, or at least many of them believe. And he made a very strong presence, rallying other Hasidic Jews and Lubavitchers to migrate to Brooklyn and take over an entire neighborhood. The Lubavitchers are still very, very present. They constantly build synagogues. They go to campuses. They send out missionaries, or what they call shliach, to discover assimilated Jews and return them to Orthodoxy. Or they'll go up to Reform Jews, who they don't consider very religious, and try to bring them back to Orthodox times. Here we see one of the Lubavitcher synagogues. This is the oldest surviving synagogue in Brooklyn. Well, a lot of times the Hasidic groups get in conflict with each other and start fighting who's going to control the synagogue. In fact, when Menachem Schneerson died, he did not appoint a successor. And that has caused a lot of confusion in the community. Why didn't he establish a synagogue? In addition to the Satmars, there are all other kinds of Bubovs and various Hasidic groups, each one distinguished by their hat, by the way they wear their hat, what kind of clothes they wear. They have their yeshivas. They avoid the public schools. The women generally cut their hair very short and will cover it with a scarf or a wig. Fascinating book is Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman, where she really describes what it is like to be an Orthodox Jewish woman. As you can see from the name, she ends up leaving the Hasidic group, getting a college education, and but gives a very good insight into these very closed and isolationist religious groups. Each group has its own dynasty. And you see just some of the names here. On the right, you see a list of the different Hasidic dynasties, and that's just from the letter B on the right. They come from different towns, and they maintain their own distinct identity, clothing, food, traditions, and most importantly, their loyalty to their dynasty of rabbis. Another big wave of Jews came to Brooklyn, as well as in Queens, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some 200,000 Jews fled Eastern Europe, the former communist countries, predominantly Russia, and especially from Central Asia. Most people don't even know about the very wealthy, culturally wealthy and famous Jewish communities of Uzbekistan, the famous Bukharian Jews. They settled in Forest Hills in their own community. The top picture on the right, you see their synagogue and buildings around it. They, once again, are very proud of being Bukhari, and they have their own language and culture, their own stores, their own synagogues, their own yeshivas, and they don't mix very well with other Jews. Other Jews settled in places like Brooklyn, where you see they have their restaurants. Some of them are very assimilated. Some of them have music stores. A sign in the middle says Knigi Muziki Filmi. These would be books, music, and films. Once again, maintaining the Russian language, whereas the Orthodox tend to speak either Bukharian or one of the Yiddish-based languages. The total Jew population of New York in 1920 was about 5.5 million. 30% of New York City at that time was Jewish. Other people say it's up to 47%. Brooklyn today has the largest Jewish population of any neighborhood. The map on the right shows over 500,000 Jews live in Brooklyn, about 200,000 in Queens, 54,000 in the Bronx. Manhattan has a quarter of a million. Staten Island's losing population down to 34. And so the emphasis is no longer on the Lower East Side, which is today a Chinese-dominated neighborhood, but the various areas in Brooklyn, especially the Hasidic areas, have a sharp rise in Jewish population. In the 5 areas, plus Nassau, Westchester, Suffolk counties, account for about 1/4 of all the Jews in the United States. Many people who cite this statistic and are not happy with it, they refer to Jew York. But it is largely merited because of the huge Jewish population and the quarter of all the Jews in the entire United States are in Brooklyn. And you see Crown Heights, Williamsburg, and Borough Park. With the other, in these black areas, over 50% of the population is Yiddish speaking. 1.3 million Jews, Brooklyn being the largest concentration. In the Hasidic areas, the Orthodox areas, Yiddish language, as you can see, still is the predominant language. Many of the Orthodox will not speak Hebrew because they consider that only God, the Messiah, should restore the pure Hebrew language, not the modernized version that they speak in Israel. So they will be speaking Yiddish, awaiting the arrival of the Messiah and the restoration of the state of Israel and the restoration of the Hebrew language. The Jewish population of New York grew very fast following 1965. This was just in time for the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the massive influx of immigrants. The graph on the right shows beginning in the 1970s, a huge rise in population. But if you look closely, you'll see that the blue areas of Ireland, Germany, Ukraine, the green areas of Italy, Russia, and Hungary were superseded by massive immigration from Mexico, from Cuba, from Philippines, from China and India. And so the demographics of the United States was radically changed with the passing of the Hart-Celler immigration reform. And these groups now largely taken over places like Queens and Brooklyn. Where I live in Queens is now a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. And areas of China and Brooklyn are now Chinatowns, Cuba towns, Mexico towns, India. I mean, this is a huge Muslim migration from Central Asia and the Middle East, taking over entire neighborhoods. So places like Brooklyn are preserving what was the diversity which they had already under Peter Stuyvesant. Little Odessa, Brighton Beach, 300,000 Russian Jews. Now, most of these are from Russia proper, not from Siberia and Central Asia, where they preserve their Russian language culture. They have their restaurants, their pharmacies, books, music, videos, souvenirs. They are not Orthodox. They speak Russian, very highly educated people with their saunas and every part of their ethnic culture. Mayor Abe Beame became a successful or somewhat successful mayor who was from Brownsville, and presided over the terrible economic decline of the city. The Jews of Brooklyn have a mixed relationship with the other residents. A lot of times there would be riots, the Crown Heights riots, where Rabbi Schneerson's car killed a young immigrant kid from Guyana. And the Black-Jewish relationship in Brooklyn has been very delicate. Famous events in Brooklyn, the famous JDL, the Jewish Defense League terrorist organization founded by Meir Kahane, an Orthodox rabbi, who said that the Jews should arm themselves and defend themselves. One of the most brutal terrorists from Brooklyn was Baruch Goldstein, the butcher of Hebron, who got a submachine gun, broke into a mosque, and murdered 29 Palestinian worshippers. Brooklyn has a tradition of being very militant, very violent, and the Goldstein and Kahane are notorious Jewish terrorists, saying that Israel should be ethnically cleansed and that it was up to these Jewish terrorist groups to make Israel Jewish again. The yeshiva controversy, a major issue. According to New York City law, children have to attend school, they have to learn math, American history, and follow a curriculum set down by the Board of Ed. However, most of the, or not most, but many of the yeshivas feel that they don't have to teach American history or mathematics. They only do religious education. This is a constant ongoing controversy Some members of the Board of Ed, some mayors have tried to force the Orthodox Jews to follow the law, but most of these rabbis say that we follow Jewish law. We don't follow the laws of New York City. Today, there are approximately 600,000 Jews in Brooklyn. About half of them are Orthodox and Hasidic. Once again, half of them are very assimilated Jews. Now, a tradition in Brooklyn and in other areas with a large concentration of Jews is to establish an eruv. An eruv is a string that goes from telephone pole to building to tree or whatever, enclosing a big area of the city where large numbers of Orthodox Jews live. And then the rabbi declares that that string is like a wall, and everything inside is like a private home. So you can carry packages, you can push strollers, as if you were in your home. On the Sabbath, you're not allowed to do a lot of these things outside of your home. But by declaring a huge section of Brooklyn to be a private home, you can then push the stroller, carry packages, and do things which would normally be forbidden. And this is one of the largest and most famous eruvs in the world because of its sheer size. Well, once again, we have discovered a fascinating aspect of New York City and of Jewish history that most people are not aware of. Jews have been migrating to New York since the Dutch colony, a diversity of people, Hasidic Jews, today the Orthodox Jews, this Bukharian Jews from Central Asia, all contributing to this rather unique and little known history of a Jewish city. Great book on cities and civilization. It is in the cities that these various Jewish groups have been able to discover and preserve their cultures. Well, if you'd like to contact me, it's ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. That's me. Now, that's what I looked like back in the 1970s when I was living in Jerusalem and doing my MA at the Hebrew University. More hair, I had some color, and I was about 20 pounds thinner. But here again, Brooklyn has its own unique Jewish history, just like Jerusalem, the Lower East Side, and so many other places in the world. So thank you for joining me today, and I hope to hear from you in the future for another exciting lecture. So this is Ronald J. Brown logging off. Thank you, and I hope to see you in the future.